Welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're very fortunate to have David Kaplan, professor of geography at Kent State University and a past president of the American Association of Geographers. Dave,
Mike.
thanks so much for being here.
No, I'm glad to be here.
Dave, as I talk with others in this series, I ask them about early interest in geography to reflect upon their childhood, perhaps, and talk a little bit about what got you interested in geography, if you think about it.
Yeah, I think I'm probably an unusual case in terms of getting interested in geography. I always did have an interest in geography, like as a kid, I remember like drawing imaginary maps and things like that, developing my own world. This is before you had things like, SimCity or any of the other computer simulations. So we all had to do it with paper and pen and, just imagination. But I loved kind of creating this sense of like, oh, yeah, well, here's this island. What's this going to look like? And what's this continent going to look like? And how do you create new worlds? And I was also a big fan of science fiction, which I think has a natural complement to geography, in the sense that, science fiction is all about people going and exploring new worlds and talking about how these new worlds differ from Earth and in some ways are the same. So, a lot of things like that become important. And, I can't even think about some of the other stuff like, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Of course, those have been very much popularized by the movies. But, I read the whole Lord of the Rings a couple of times as a kid, and I loved them. And of course, those came complete with maps of these different places like the Shire and Mordor and Eriador and those sorts of things. So, maps were always important to me. And I think with geography, my interest was really that because I had this kind of interest in other places and in maps, I kind of had also an opportunity that many other people may not have. And the opportunity is that I grew up as a Clark brat. And my father was a professor of psychology at Clark University.
This is one of Clark's strongest fields.
Right. And psychology is one of Clark's strongest fields. Well, psychology and geography.
Right.
In fact, he was university professor, which meant that he could teach in a number of different disciplines. And he was just a very big presence on a fairly small campus. But as it happens, he ended up working with a lot of geographers. I think some of it might have been the fact that, of course, at Clark, the two big PhD programs were geography and psychology.
Right.
Also, that some of this coincided with the sort of behavioral revolution in geography during the 1960s and early 70s, where there was that combination of psychology and geography. And I think also my pop's friendships with a number of different people who ended up becoming very, very, who were at the time very, very prominent in geography. So as an anecdote, for example, my first encyclopedia, in fact, my only encyclopedia came from Bob Cates.
Really?
Well known as, of course, the environmental vulnerability and hazards. At the time, I didn't know anything about that, but I do know that he and his lovely wife, Ellie, let me go down to their house once a week and pick up a volume of the World Book Encyclopedia. We went all the way from A to Z. And so
those were wonderful encyclopedias. I don't know if they still put them out, but I recall myself, just spending hours going through a particular volume, just enjoying them.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the way it was with me. So, getting it from the Cates. My pop was always also very good friends with Saul Cohen, who, well-known political geographer, Roger Kasperson. So just a lot of these people who are just more or less part of our daily, circle of friends and colleagues. So when, I got to be a little older, and I was thinking of maybe, maybe I'd like to take some courses. Clark was right there. And I had a very unusual high school experience that maybe also precipitated my a descent or ascent into geography. When I was, the period of time when I grew up, and probably when you grew up too, is, there was a very tempestuous time. A lot of the public schools were not at their best. We were in Worcester, Massachusetts, which wasn't, horrible public schools, but not really all that great. And so one thing I did as a high school student is I ended up taking a number of college courses, which now is very, very common. Most states have dual enrollment programs, and high school students can be found in college classes throughout. And I know that's happened in my case, but probably in your case as well. But at that time, it was very, very unusual. So you had to get a whole bunch of special permissions from principals and other administrators. And basically, I used that time to take classes at Clark. Interestingly enough, I never took a class in psychology. My father's school would never have taken a class in psychology. But what I did do is I took a lot of classes in geography. I wasn't sure this is what I was going to specialize in my life, but I knew that there were some interesting people who taught these classes, and I thought it would be fun to take them. And so I took my earliest class was with a professor at Clark, a guy named Martin Bowden. I'm not even sure if he's
very reputable in terms of his teaching. Sal Cohen told me that he was really the best lecturer they had.
He was the best lecturer, probably one of the best lecturers I've ever had. And the thing with Martin is I took this course called Survey of Geography, which was mostly him just going over the basics of geography, physical and human geography. He would sometimes bring in other people to lecture. I remember people like Annette Buttimer coming and talking to our class, or Douglas Johnson, or other people who were at Clark. But I would say of all of them, Martin Bowden was the one who shone. He just was a very, very powerful, passionate lecturer.
Cohen related to me that he had brought many students into geography. He was really one of the strongest catalysts among the undergraduates.
Yeah, and I will say this is that I feel like in some ways he may not have been as appreciated as he might be for that role, because he truly was such an incredible presence, and really just a wonderful first instructor for geography. So I took my sort of survey of geography with him, and then I took like the intro to cultural geography, which was basically human geography, with him the next semester. And I also took a few classes with Sal Cohen, who at the time was at Clark and was teaching political geography. And that was a lot of fun. And then I took a statistics class with Perry Hansen, who's Sue Hansen's husband, which was a lot of fun. So I basically had this sort of immersion in geography and some other fields too. I took things like English and political science or whatnot. But I had this immersion even before I went to college. And so, I just grew up thinking of geography as just this normal discipline. In fact, as a very prominent discipline. I didn't go to college at Clark, but I always took this Clark geography with me as I moved forward in my career.
And so then you went to Hopkins.
Then I went to Johns Hopkins, yeah, and one of the things that was nice at the time is that Clark was very generous. I don't know if they have these deals now, but they helped to offset a lot of the tuition at other schools. And my pop was really high on Johns Hopkins, probably because, it had such a strong sort of graduate reputation. And it also had a geography department, which is what I was looking for. Now, when I went to Hopkins, I came in thinking I might major in geography, but they actually didn't have as much of a geography presence as I was hoping for. They did have David Harvey, and I did take a class with David Harvey, but that was pretty much it when it came to any kind of human geography. And of course, David Harvey had a specific type of human geography, which was fine. But I was going and thinking, oh yeah, I'd like to have a course in economic geography. I'd like to have a political geography. I'd like to have a social geography. I'd like to have, urban geography and all these other things that, you think about when you go into a geography department. And they really didn't have that. So I moved over and ended up majoring in English and history, which are two
Hmm.
things that I had been very much interested in. Took a couple of geography courses while I was at Hopkins, but it kind of, stayed somewhat dormant. But then after I was done, after I finished college, I decided that, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go to graduate school. So I took the year off. Unfortunately, I ended up graduating during the big 1982 recession. And so hard to find a job, but I found sort of a cruddy job and then decided, well, maybe grad school isn't so bad after all. So within a few months, I said, well, I think I'm going to go to grad school. I took the GRE. And then I ended up deciding that, well, I didn't have a whole lot of geography. And so I might want to go back home. I stayed with my parents for the spring, and I ended up taking a bunch more classes at Clark,
Hmm.
which, all in geography, which really gave me a nice background. I had classes with Jerry Carrasco,
Hmm.
probably the founder, I think, of Economic Geography, that journal.
Hmm.
I took an economic geography class with him. I took a class on geographic thought. And it was really just like kind of a fun semester before I went on to graduate school.
And then you went to Madison to
Yeah.
graduate
So for
school.
graduate school, I went to Wisconsin Madison. And, that was obviously in geography. And it was a great time, great place to be.
Will you comment on some of your professors at Madison?
Well, I had, the thing about UW Madison, of course, is that it prided itself on offering the range of geography. It was not in a specific niche, So, there are plenty of examples of departments that are kind of tied to a particular either ideological framework or more often kind of a subject framework. So, the clearest example would be University of Delaware, which is
Sure.
climatology. See, they do have human geographers. I know them, but it's still very much a climatology type of program. Other departments like Syracuse are much more wedded to human geography. Even Clark, in many ways, it had physical geography and had some good physical geographers, but it was predominantly a human geography department. But Wisconsin was always very much we are going to cover all the bases, and so they had a
And
very strong.
cartography. And
Exactly, and
you know.
cartography was huge, and they had
Hmm.
a separate cartography bachelor's
And
uh,
masters.
and a master's,
Yeah.
yeah, and they had a number of great cartography professors. In fact, when I was there, David Woodward was just starting off on his history of cartography project.
Hmm.
He'd just gotten like a bunch of money and was working with Brian Harley together. And he managed to get Brian Harley a position at UW Milwaukee. And of course, David was at UW Madison. And so they were teaming up to create this big history of photography, which I remember had a whole set of offices. It had one of the first like dedicated word processors I'd ever seen. It must have had like 20-inch floppy disks or something like that. These were just these massive like cylinders that they were using. And all the stuff that went into that particular project. And in fact, one of my first colleagues was Matthew Edney. He and
Hmm.
I started off, and Matthew, of course, now I believe is in charge of the project or involved in some ways. But he came in to work on that project, and I think he's continued with that interest. But there was Woodward. There's a guy named Phil Murky who'd written a number of cartography
Right. The
books,
map
and I'm not even in
interpretation textbook is phenomenal.
cartography.
Yeah.
But so they had the cartography segment, and then they had the great physical geographers. They had Jim Knox,
Hmm.
the fluvial geomorphologist, who I died too young, but really was just such a huge figure. In fact, he was chair when I started. And a number of other physical geographers, climatologists,
Hmm.
and geomorphologists, and biogeographers. Tom Vale, for example, is a great biogeographer that I was working with. And then they had a series of human geographers. And, there was Bob Sack was there, David Ward, who
Sure.
was a great historical geographer and went on to become chancellor of the University of Wisconsin. People like Bob
And another
Osterman.
AAG president.
and another AAG president, and Bob Ostergren, who's an historical geographer, Bill Denevan, who is more like a human environment kind of person, Martin Cadwallader, who was more of a economic behavioral geographer, and so a bunch of these people, and then Yi-Fu Tuan, who had just started at Wisconsin. They managed to convince him to move from Minnesota, so he was another human geographer. So they had good sort of connections with all these different aspects. And Wisconsin, unlike Clark, I mean, Clark had some great people inside and outside geography, and I could name many of them. But Wisconsin was a massive university at the time. It was the second largest in the country, and they had these great departments of sociology or political science, languages and literatures, history. So one of the best things about Madison was the ability to take a whole bunch of classes outside of geography with some fantastic professors, which I really appreciate, and I think took advantage of pretty well.
And were there any individual faculty that served as significant mentors that really created for you perhaps a paradigm of research to follow?
Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, I certainly had a couple of good advisors. Bob Sack was my advisor for my master's. And I mean, I learned a lot from Bob. And of course, Bob did great things. He was in the midst of doing some of his very significant work on territoriality at that time. And then because I became more quantitative for my PhD, I ended up working with Martin Cadwallader, who was just a wonderful man, a very easy person to deal with. That being said, I think one thing that I kind of gathered at Wisconsin was a lot of independence. I was not one of those graduate students who sort of followed as an acolyte of a particular faculty member, like in the case of working with Bob and later on the case of working with Martin, I think I pretty much blazed my own path in many ways. I did what I needed to do, and they were good enough about letting me do it. They gave me a lot of independence. So
not everywhere will let you do that.
Yeah. I mean, and so there wasn't sort of, and in fact, in some ways I've kind of followed that model in terms of my own advising, is that I am not, I say I'm not one of those lab advisors, where you assemble all your students, you call it a lab and you say, hey, we're going to be working on this project together. And, you're all going to be doing variations of this. In this case, I was doing something that was completely different from anything that Martin had done. And I did something that was completely different from what Bob had done. I was able to come up with a few publications, but, neither of them really contributed to it. They were supportive. But so in the sense, it was nice for me to find my own legs. But, in the sense of like finding a sort of a towering kind of mentor that, I was very much tied to in their thinking, that wasn't the case. Now, I think there were other people who could have said, like a lot of Jim Knox's students very much followed in his footsteps. A lot of Bill Denevan students followed in his footsteps. Certainly David Woodward students followed in his footsteps. By the time I was there, Ward was kind of transitioning away from
into administration.
Going into administration. But
and what about your fellow students? You must have had a strong group of graduate students.
Oh, we had a wonderful group. We had a wonderful group of people. I feel very blessed in that regard because I obviously see a lot of our graduate cohorts here at Kent State. I know even when I was in Wisconsin, different graduate cohorts that went in. But my graduate cohort was just really phenomenal, just in terms of the kind of bonding that we had, the different people that we hung out with from all different kinds of persuasions, and the fact that, we still get together a lot during AAG meetings and things like that. So, I already mentioned Matthew, of course, who I still see from time to time, but people like Doug Faulkner, who's a geomorphologist up at UW Eau Claire. In fact, I just gave a talk at Eau Claire a month ago and was able to really catch up with Doug. people who I continue to work with throughout my professional career, like Guntram Herb.
Mm-hmm.
He and I, of course, have done a lot of work on nationalism. He was there. A guy I also continued to work with a lot in terms of some of my urban endeavors, particularly my urban geography textbook, a guy named Steve Holloway, who's
Mm-hmm.
now a professor at the University of Georgia. Guntram is at Middlebury, but Steve's at the University of Georgia, has been there a long time. So these are all connections that I made there. And I would say that those are probably stronger and more potent than the connections I had with, say, the faculty.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of horizontal bonding that took place. And I think in some ways it might have been because there was less interaction between faculty and grad students than you find in some schools.
Mm-hmm.
It often made me think that there are a couple of different ways in which graduate programs work. And this was definitely where you had a lot more of horizontal affiliations. So, the senior faculty seemed to be very, very tight with the senior faculty there. The junior faculty, I think, were just a little nervous about getting tenure.
Well, it was a department that had the reputation for making it difficult for junior faculty to get tenure.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to others. They kept their standards, is I guess what they would say, but other
Mhm.
people might say it differently. I felt I had a wonderful. I mean, I guess that was it. But I'd also say that in terms of the graduate students, there's just a great deal of bonding, as I said, between me and these other physical geographers and human geographers and cartography people. We had, a lot of great get-togethers. We had like almost every other week event called Beer and Loafing, which apparently they have kind of kept up. And it would be somebody would come in and present their slides of some place that they had been, some foreign or domestic destination, and they would, just kind of give a joking presentation about it. And we always buy lots and lots of beer ahead of time. Now, this was Wisconsin, and this was in the 80s. So you had beer everywhere, right?
As there should be, right?
As it should be. I mean, even for seminars, people would bring in cases of beer, and it was an expectation. And so this beer and loafing was just a wonderful way of bonding. And I think there was, a whole lot of things that we did together, canoe trips and picnics and other types of things that made it a very special time for being a student in Madison. I don't, I
Well,
wish everybody had that experience.
Those are just different activities and different kinds of behaviors that really can serve as a model or parts of a model that will facilitate the strength of a department, at least among the student body and even among faculty, I'm convinced.
Yeah. Oh, I remember too, like, we had people when I came in, there were more senior graduate students at the time. Mike Keebles, who's a climatologist, he's a professor at Denver University. And then Tom Clack, who was like a sort of an urban economic geographer who's now at College of the Atlantic or College of New England in Maine. And these were like some of the funnest people you ever wanted to hang out with. And, it kind of set the stage. So it was a great time to be a student from the social point of view. And it was just a great time to be a student from the intellectual point of view, because in addition to all the social activities we had, we ended up having a number of intellectual discussions. We had a couple of reading groups, but these would be reading groups that were very much instigated by the students themselves. I was able to take advantage of several seminars outside of geography, which was really just a fantastic thing, and meet a whole bunch of people who were not geographers. In fact, one of my best friends at the time and a roommate was a political science PhD student. I also got to know a lot of the history PhD students and other students like that.
And did you find that those relationships really, with students outside of geography, really fueled in some ways a different perspective in terms of the intellectual development that you yourself experienced as you were pursuing your own research?
You mean in terms of the students who are from outside the geography
Yes.
department? Yeah, I mean, it was always great to bounce off ideas. I think one thing I found out, especially taking a lot of sociology seminars, I ended up minoring in sociology. That was one of the things that PhD students did, is they had to pick a minor. And I minored in sociology. I took a range of sociology courses, but much of it was focused on population issues. And I must have taken about 5 or 6 sociology courses when I was there. And
Mhm.
Carl Teuber, who was extremely well known as a scholar of segregation from the
Mhm.
early 60s, was on my PhD committee. In fact, he was so well known. He was one of those people that, when I came into Wisconsin, I heard the name Carl Teuber from many years before. I was kind of surprised that he was still alive.
Mhm.
I was like, oh, you're still here. But he'd done this work with his wife in Chicago, like about 25 years prior to that. But yeah, so that was good. But then in terms of the students, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I kind of gathered was, I'd always thought of geography as being particularly neurotic in terms of what it was and, what's the place of geography and how do we define our field and all the other issues that we often deal with as geographers. But I realize that other disciplines have many of the same discussions. They're also neurotic about where they are and what they do and how they do it. And it was kind of I guess, a little bit of a surprise to me that this was something that was true.
Mhm. So from Wisconsin, you took an academic appointment in Chicago?
Nope, California. Yeah, my first job was at the University of Southern California. So
Okay.
yeah, so I was at Wisconsin probably longer than I needed to be. I always
Mhm.
say I probably took another year. I got married there. I met my wife there, and we got married in Wisconsin. We got married in a park in Madison, and I mean, one of the things about that department is that they weren't all that. They could have done a better job at the time of kind of pushing people along.
Mhm.
I think they produced some wonderful people. But it took me 3 years to do my master's. At Kent State, where pretty much you got to do it in 2. It took me 5 years to do my PhD, but I had a good time, and it was hard
Mhm.
to move away. And I was able to get some support for that entire time. But I was, entering into the early 90s when I needed to look for a job. And like anybody who's got a PhD, who's interested in an academic position, it was a little bit unnerving. It's, I mean, there may have been a golden age sometime when it was really easy to get academic jobs. I mean, I've heard maybe the late 60s were like that.
Mhm.
Certainly not the mid 70s, because I knew just from my pops, contacts that, it wasn't easy getting an academic job then, but maybe earlier. But certainly in the early 90s, it was not good at all. There was a mild recession taking place. There were a lot of, people looking for a limited number of jobs. And I know I had done my PhD work on Canada. I did both my master's and PhD work in Canada. And so, I think there was sort of a sense like, okay, well, this is all very good, but who the hell does Canada unless they're Canadian? So I didn't have a great geographical niche because the Canadian
Mhm.
universities were mostly interested in hiring other Canadians,
Well, it
and
was very difficult for Americans to get landed immigrant status in Canada in the 90s.
it was. They had a lot of job ads that said that basically, we're definitely going to prefer Canadian applicants, and there were plenty of them. So I didn't really land a job in Canada. I couldn't land a job in Canada. I remember one university inviting me for an interview and asking about my immigration status. When I said I'm an American, they said, "Oh, sorry." So I mean, that was the way it was, and I didn't have a whole lot of luck. It was
Mhm.
very my first year out. Uh, well, I would say my first year looking, I just came up dry, and then I spent another year, and that was probably applying 1 year too early. And then the next year, well, that was the year that I did get my PhD, and I did have to look. And I remember it being a very dispiriting year because I did get an interview at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis,
Mm-hmm.
which seemed to go okay. But then again, I think they were looking for somebody else. I was offered an interview at Ohio State, which I was very excited about. But then they pulled the interview at the last minute. The chair called me up and says, "Oh, we're pulling the interview," which was, very disheartening. And I graduated with a PhD, or I defended my PhD without any job in hand. And it was, one of the very bleak moments where thinking, well, what am I going to do now? Am I going to like try to beg for, some teaching position at Wisconsin? They really didn't have a lot of room for that. Am I going to find another job like in retail? I mean, how am I going to get by? I had a wife, and I was just looking at what's happening. And then I think it was about a week and a half or so after I defended my PhD, I get a call from Kurt Roseman.
Yeah.
And Kurt Roseman,
He was a chair at
wonderful
USC.
yeah,
Mhm.
and he was a chair at USC, and he'd kind of been brought over to USC from Illinois in order to revive the program, actually start a graduate program there. And he calls me up and basically offers me a 1 year position.
Mhm.
Now, I had applied for that. I just hadn't remembered it. And it sort of been like, okay. And I was like, okay, I'll take it. And so they were nice enough about flying my wife and I out and helping us look for a place to live, and getting it set up. And Kurt himself was a wonderful host in terms of showing us around Los Angeles and all the other aspects of the department. And so, yeah, we ended up, moving on out to Los Angeles, and thinking, at the time, Kurt thought that it could be a multi-year type of thing, and there's even a possibility of a tenure track job. But that was a year that USC not only had major fiscal issues because of enrollment drop, but they also had the riots in
Mhm.
Los Angeles. And so the riots happened towards the end of my stay there, but the fiscal issue happened at the beginning. So then I was, knew I probably needed to find another job, and so I was looking early and had a lot more success that time around. I always tell students that, like, sometimes you just need to be in the system, and then you gain a lot of credibility. And so I was able to get the several interviews, and I got 2 job offers and was able to pick from that, which was good.
And you went to
University of St. Thomas.
yeah.
Yeah, University of St. Thomas is a school that, and I just visited last month for the first time in
Mhm.
decades. But it's a school that is right on the Mississippi River. It's in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's a beautiful, beautiful campus. And and I kind of went there and I was like, wow, this is really nice. And they were just developing a brand new geography program. It just seemed so exciting to me. And the guy who was uh, hired me, he'd only been there another year or so. And so, I was like, okay, it's going to be the 2 of us developing this new thing. And, very exciting. And so I turned down the other job that I was offered, and I just decided that this would be a good place. And so we ended up staying there 3 years. I liked the guy I worked with, Bob Werner, wonderful, wonderful gentleman. A lot of the other faculty I liked okay too. Never any problem. A lot of the students I liked, but it was small.
Mhm.
It only had 7 majors. There were only the 2 of us faculty, and I was on one hand kind of worried that if cuts are going to come, this is one
Sure.
of those places. As it is, geography has stayed on there.
And so after St. Thomas, where did you go?
So after St. Thomas, that's where I went to Kent State.
Yeah.
So
And
that's when
and you decided you would make the move to go to Kent, Ohio. And at the time, Kent State had a difficulty attracting students too, didn't they?
well, in a way, so Kent State was an interesting place to go. I went to, I started applying in St. Thomas. I just figured, okay, I didn't want to, they were starting the tenure process or the pre-tenure process, and I didn't really want to get wrapped up in the pre-tenure and then end up leaving. So I knew I had to apply, and I did. And I applied mainly to graduate programs, well, only to graduate programs. And Kent State ended up becoming the first school that really kind of picked up on that. They interviewed me before Thanksgiving and offered me the job at the beginning of December. And I knew the guy who had been in the job before me, a guy named Barney Wharf, who
Mm-hmm.
is at Kansas, and I've kept up with Barney a lot. I mean, Barney and I are good friends. At the time, I still knew him, and I talked to him about what Kent State was about, and he'd left, so it wasn't all wonderful, but I realized that I think I can handle this. And when I came to Kent State, they had the advantage of having a PhD program. And really
Mm-hmm.
all I'd been looking for initially was a master's program because I really liked that aspect of my job. I like mentoring students. I like being able to work with them on their projects. And, the problem with a place like St. Thomas is there just wasn't as much of the opportunity
Sure.
to do that. But I figured having a master's program would be a good thing. And then having a PhD program was even better. They had certainly some good faculty, and it seemed like it kind of fit the bill. I pulled out of any other job applications that I had going on, and I just made the decision to move there. There were some difficulties. The department politics at the time was not at its best. There was a few kind of warring factions like you have in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
departments. I think the graduate, there are some great graduate students, but some, I don't think our standards were as high then as they are now, quite honestly.
Well,
I
you've
felt
produced
like-
some stellar students.
Yeah. Oh, and there's no question that we have. And even at that time, I think we were producing some good students. But I would just say that, there was just it was more mixed, I think, than it is now. And then the faculty I thought was, decent. It certainly left open a spot for me, my interests and what I was going to do. The kind of facilities were nice. They gave me a nice startup package. And then I automatically had a lot of students who were interested in working with me. So there were a lot of great incentives to moving. One thing I'd say is that, the city of Kent at the time was not the most delightful place.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought of living in Ohio, and the city of Kent was a little run down. Part of it was because of the May 4th, the whole incident with the National
Right.
Guard. I think the city and the university had very much drifted apart from each other. A lot of the people in the town were very suspicious of the gown and vice versa. I felt like Kent State was actually building itself away from the town as opposed to towards the town. So I wasn't too crazy about that aspect of things. The enrollments, I don't think were terrible. I think it'd been long enough ago. It'd already been 25 years. So
Mhm.
I didn't feel as if the enrollments were suffering all that much. But, one thing Barney had mentioned to me was that, he didn't think that Kent State had the constituency that it might have. Akron had a constituency, Cleveland State had a constituency, but who was there in the legislature arguing for Kent State? So he saw that as a potential problem. As it turned out, that wasn't a problem. I mean, since I've been at Kent, it's stayed very healthy from an economic point of view,
Mhm.
even in relatively hard times. But yeah, moving there was, as I said, the town itself was, coming from St. Paul, which is one of the most delightful cities, I think, in the United States, to Kent, Ohio, where, it seemed like the downtown was being hollowed out and you had these weird town-gown relationships wasn't the best. But, we decided to stay. We lived in town. I was always, adamant about being within walking distance of
Mhm.
the university. So we made the best of it.
And you've been there, my goodness, for not 30
20
years.
I've been
25,
there
28, 7?
28 and a half.
Wow.
28 and a half years. Yeah. 20 and a half years. I know. It's like, it's kind of crazy. And since that time, Kent has actually become a delightful town. That's what's so interesting about it is
Hmm.
that, the whole time, because I was an urban geographer and interested in, the kind of community development types of operations, I was always kind of sounding the alarm as much as I could for improving the nature of the city and, making it more attractive to students and doing something about some of the transportation mistakes that have been made in the past. And they did that. I mean, especially beginning in 2007, 2008, they began to completely transform the city
That's great.
into a very, very nice city. And they began to move the university towards the city
Hmm.
physically as well as emotionally. So there's a lot more kind of interactions between
Sure.
town and gown. And that happened over the course of just a few years. They built a hotel downtown. They kind of developed much better kind of placement of Kent State facilities in the downtown area. It did the kinds of things that make students very happy to go downtown and really be
Well,
part of the whole.
that's certainly important, and it's important to have engaged faculty, right? And I would,
Mhm.
and you do have that reputation for engaging with students, and I wonder also if, as you have progressed in your career, if your status in the discipline has actually attracted a number of students as well, as you went to vice president and president of the American Association of Geographers, editor of the Geographical Review, and other things. These these offices that you have held and currently hold must bring some students to you.
It's hard to say. I mean, thank you for those shout outs. I I think I had a few. I know when I was the AAG president, it seemed like there was an uptick of students saying, "Oh, it'd be good to work with me."
Hmm.
I've always been very lucky, though, Mike, in terms of my students, in terms of my graduate students. I've actually advised or am advising about 55 master's and PhD students. So I've had a lot over the years. And I've had, really some spectacular people and, just many, many wonderful memories and wonderful contacts now. And, the folks that I got to know before, I guess I, was better known, and folks that come in now afterwards, I'd say they've all been just extremely fulfilling. So I'm not sure if I can make that linkage as much. There might have been a slight uptick that people knew when I
Hmm.
was an AAG president, but I don't know if that's persisted. Uh, I maybe it.
Let's comment on your role as president for just a moment.
Sure.
Would you care to consider or just relate to our viewers, our listeners, how significant the role the AAG president is, and what you might find yourself doing, advocating for, or discussing with others concerning the discipline in that office.
Okay, well that's good. I've been involved in the AAG um, for a while. I always went to the meetings. I'd only missed a handful, well, less than a handful. I think just two since like 1990 or so. So I'd been to these different conferences, and in the aughts, if we can call them the aughts, I guess that's the word. I was very active in the East Lakes Regional Division, so I was the president. Somebody asked me, in fact, to be president, and I ran for it. It was a competitive election. And then after I was president for 3 years, I was the regional counselor for another 3 years. So I was on the council, I think between 2006 and nine, something like
Hmm.
that. And so I got a chance to sort of see the AAG at that point in time. Those are good times in many ways for the AAG because geography as a whole was just really increasing in terms of the numbers of people who are going into geography. The whole National Geographic standard stuff was still very strong. There was a lot of work that was being done at the AAG in terms of bolstering its finances and being involved in grant activity and all kinds of things. So this was a very flush time for the discipline and for the organization. And it was a great opportunity to be involved. And then, I kind of went back to, doing other things. I had, kind of a great career in the early 2010s. I ended up spending a year as a visiting chair in France and University of Paris. And then I was a visiting professor at the University of Oregon. And then I joined the American Geographical Society in 2014, and not long after became editor of the Geographical Review. And so those were all great things. And then, in 2017, was it 2000? I guess it was 2017. I was told that I had been nominated to be the vice president of the AAG, and I was just stunned. I remember that fall, just getting that email and thinking, and I just contacted them back just because I thought it was a mistake. I honestly thought it was a mistake. I was like, well, are you sure? And they were all new people since the last time I'd been around. So I didn't really know them. And I said, okay, says, oh, no, it's real. And so I said, all right, great. And so, I figured, well, if I'm going to be nominated, I better win this damn thing. So, you know what I mean? You can't campaign, but I did want to win. I thought this is a great honor, and I don't want the honor just to be that I was nominated and didn't win. I want the honor to be that I won. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what my vision of geography and of the organization was. And I looked through a number of other sort of nominating statements. I couldn't do anything about my CV. My CV was respectable. It is. But, I thought, well, a lot of CVs are respectable and some of them are well more than respectable, right? So, I really want to speak to the people who may actually read these things. And I looked back over past statements and I realized a lot of them were kind of boilerplate. The people hadn't spent as much time. They hadn't thought about it as much, a little bit. And I thought, I'm going to really think about this. And so I went ahead and I, wrote up, I think, a really good nominating statement. I sent it to a few of my colleagues, trusted colleagues. I won't mention who, but people who were very much distinguished members of the organization and had been involved, gave me some great tips. And I honestly think that that's what got me the election. People would mention, oh, we really liked your statement, the people who read it, because it's one thing where I mentioned issues like institutional diversity and the importance of paying attention to that.
I think you were the first candidate, maybe for any office, that mentioned something about the value of community colleges and the importance of community colleges in that statement.
Right, and that's because I had often thought that these were important. This came from the heart. And I also thought, a lot of, as I said, a lot of it is, well, we have to make geography more relevant to the world today kind of stuff, which is all well and good. But let's think about things specific. What do we do as, a president and as a discipline and as an organization that can, maybe show that we are more than just, an R1 based organization, which I felt like that was a danger.
Well, I think in some ways it launched a shift in geography education or in the organization with reference to looking at geography beyond the ivory tower.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I at least I felt that was important. And the people say, well, these things don't matter. I think they do. And I always say to people who are applying for anything, pay a lot of attention to your statement. A lot of people may not read them, but some people do, and those people who do can make a difference.
Dave, we have about a minute to go here.
Oh, geez.
I'm going to ask. We could talk for probably 3 hours or more, which we have. But I'm going to ask you to think about your career, think about geography, think about your students, and reflect upon where you've been and offer words of wisdom or some advice for prospective students in geography or graduate students or even colleagues.
Wow, well, that's a big charge.
Well, you don't have to do all of them, but
Well, I
Yeah.
think it depends. I think, well, I mean, this is going to sound cliche, but I would say don't try to predict what the trends are going to be. Don't try to do things in a way as to satisfy wherever you think geography is going or your career ought to go. You should be aware of stuff like that, but you really do need to be very true to yourself. I would say from the point of view of a graduate student that if they're working on a project, and most of them would be, that remember that it is your project, okay? And you need to take ownership of that project. And you need to do whatever you can to show that it belongs to you, not to your advisor, but to you. And that's something that I've always taken to heart. And I try to inculcate to all my students. I would say to those people who are looking to get a job, whether it be an academic job or another job, is, especially academic jobs are difficult, but they're attainable. You just need to be persistent. Okay. Get yourself a good, mentor or several mentors. But think that, if you keep on working at something, it will generally come through for you. And I found that with my own students, and I've also found that with colleagues and other people who things seemed kind of dark for a while, but they came through. And one value I think I bring is that I've gone through, it hasn't been an easy glide.
Right.
And so in that sense, maybe I'm living proof of the fact that persistence can pay off.
I would like to see that iterated by others, really, that it's very important to be persistent as we really pursue our passion of practicing geography. Okay?
Exactly. And I think geography as a field needs to be persistent too. So, keep on
Dave,
moving it ahead.
Thank you so very much for joining us today. This has really been a great episode. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mike.
Okay. Well, this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.